Remove him. 2 words. Richard Sterling didn't stop walking, didn't turn around, didn't look at the man's face. Just flicked his hand at the security guard the way you flick a light switch, and kept moving toward his car like the whole thing had already left his mind before it finished leaving his mouth. The old man on the bench stood up slowly, gathered his blanket, and moved. He walked around the corner of the building, stood with his back against the cold stone, and waited. Then he came back, sat down in the exact same spot, and went back to watching the front doors of Sterling Tower, the building with his name on it. The building his son had just had him thrown out of, the building he had built from nothing while Richard was still in school learning how to take credit for other people's work. His name was Arthur Sterling. He was worth $4 billion. And not one person on that plaza had any idea. Welcome to Echo Tales by Ken. I'm Ken. What you just saw is not the beginning of this story. It is the moment everything this man built was about to be decided. Stay with me. But to understand what it means, I need to take you back 6 months. To a Tuesday evening in October, when Arthur Sterling sat in a doctor's office on the 41st floor of a building on Park Avenue and heard the word 18 months spoken in the same tone a man might use to describe a weather forecast. And I need you to understand who Arthur was before he became the man on the bench. He was not a man who had inherited anything. His father was a machinist from Akron, Ohio, who worked the same floor of the same factory for 31 years and died with a pension, a paid-off house, and an old military jacket he never talked about. Arthur had grown up watching his father come home with grease under his fingernails and a dignity that had nothing to do with money. He went to college on a scholarship, studied engineering, and spent the first decade of his career doing work that no one noticed because it was the kind of work that held things together rather than the kind that put your name on anything. He was 29 years old when he won his first independent contract. It was for a mid-sized shipping company that needed their loading infrastructure overhauled and couldn't afford the firms whose names you would recognize. Arthur did it in 11 weeks, under budget, and the shipping company CEO sent a handwritten note to 3 other CEOs. That was how Sterling Industries began. Not with a pitch deck, not with investors. With a handwritten note passed between men who understood that the person you want is the one who shows up and does the work. By the time Arthur was 40, he had 200 people working for him. By the time he was 50, he had 2,000. He built the tower on Fifth Avenue not because he needed the real estate, but because his wife Margaret had always said that the measure of a company was whether it believed in its own permanence. She died 4 years ago. Pancreatic cancer, 7 weeks from diagnosis to the end. Arthur had been at her bedside for every one of those 49 days, and he had not cried until she was gone, and he was alone in the hospital corridor, and a nurse he had never met put her hand briefly on his shoulder and said nothing, just stood there for a moment, and that small human kindness from a stranger broke something open in him that the 7 weeks of fighting had not been able to reach. He thought about that nurse a lot in the months that followed. He had 3 children. Richard was the eldest, 44 years old, Harvard MBA, 12 years inside Sterling Industries, in a series of roles that had positioned him for succession without ever requiring him to build anything himself. Richard was intelligent and well-dressed and completely convinced that the ability to analyze a business was equivalent to the ability to run one. He had filed a succession memo with the board 3 weeks before Arthur's diagnosis. Arthur found out about it from his CFO, not from his son. Camille was 39, based in Paris, and had spent the better part of a decade building a personal brand around a family name. She described her work as impact investment and philanthropic advocacy. She had 1.4 million followers on Instagram. She had visited the Sterling Industries offices 4 times in the past 3 years, twice to be photographed there. Arthur loved his daughter in the complicated way you love someone who has become a person you don't fully recognize. And then there was Grace. Grace was 32 and had walked out of Sterling Industries board meeting 5 years ago, a meeting she had not been invited to but had shown up for anyway, and driven to Atlanta and started teaching high school English the following September. She taught the same kids every year that the system had already written off. She drove a 7-year-old Civic and rented a 2-bedroom house, and was the only one of his children Arthur had ever looked at and thought, she got it right. She didn't come to New York anymore. After Margaret died, the family had fractured in the quiet way families do when the person who held the center is gone. Grace had called every week for a year. then every 2 weeks. Then the calls became texts. Arthur understood it. He had not made it easy to love him from a distance. He sat with all of this on the drive home from the doctor's office. 18 months. The treatment might extend it, might not. He was 71 years old, and he had built something significant, and he was sitting in traffic on the FDR drive thinking about a nurse who had put her hand on his shoulder and said nothing, and about the difference between people who see you and people who see what you're worth. He parked in the underground garage and sat in the car with the engine off for a long time. Then he took the elevator up to the penthouse, walked past the living room without turning on the lights, and went to the storage room at the end of the hall. He moved Margaret's winter coats aside. He still hadn't given them away. He wasn't ready, and found the box in the back. He pulled it out, set it on the floor, opened it. His father's military jacket was inside, folded with the precision of a man who believed that how you stored something was how you honored it. His father had worn it through 2 tours, and never once described what he'd seen in them. When he died, he left Arthur the jacket and a message delivered through a neighbor. Keep it until you understand what it means. Arthur lifted the jacket out of the box. He held it for a moment, then he called Marcus. Marcus Cole had been Arthur's executive assistant for 19 years. He knew things about Arthur that no one else alive knew, and he kept him the way a safe keeps things, without effort, without performance, simply because that was what he was built for. Arthur told him what he was thinking. Not a plan yet, just a question out loud. If I sat on that bench outside the building tomorrow morning, wearing this jacket, would my children stop? Marcus was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "What do you need me to do?" It took 11 days to become Sarge. That was the name Arthur gave the man on the bench. Not to anyone else, just to himself. Privately, the way a writer names a character they're not sure about yet. Sarge, a name with history in it, a name that implied a story without telling it. Marcus handled the logistics with the same quiet efficiency he brought to everything else. He found a second-hand wool blanket from a thrift store in Queens, a styrofoam cup, a cardboard sign that said veteran, God bless in black marker. He sourced a pair of worn work boots 2 sizes off from Arthur's actual size so that the walk would look different. The posture would shift naturally. Arthur grew out his stubble for a week, then shaved in a pattern that aged him without looking theatrical. He was already 71. He didn't need much. The first morning, he sat down on the bench at 7 a.m. He felt something he had not felt in a very long time. Invisible, not ignored. Ignored implied that someone had seen you and chosen not to engage. This was something older and quieter than that. He was simply not in the frame. People walked past him the way you walk past a planter or a lamppost, with a slight unconscious adjustment in trajectory that required no thought at all. His own doorman, a man named Gerald who had greeted Arthur by name every morning for 11 years, walked past him twice, looked directly at the bench both times, did not register that there was a person on it. Arthur sat with that. He came back the second day and the third. He learned the rhythm of the plaza. The morning rush between 7:30 and 9, when the building filled up with people who all had somewhere to be. The mid-morning lull, when a few smokers came out and the delivery trucks rolled through. The lunch wave at 12:30. He watched all of it from the bench with the focused attention of a man who had spent a career reading rooms and was now reading the most honest room he had ever been in. On the 4th day, he met Eddie. Eddie Washington had been working the corner of the plaza for almost 2 years. He was 57 years old, originally from Baltimore, and had landed in New York after a series of events he described without self-pity and without embellishment when Arthur asked him about them, which Arthur did. Because Arthur had learned from his father that the right way to talk to someone was to ask them something real and then be quiet. Eddie had worked construction for 20 years, lost 3 fingers on a job site where the safety protocols were not what the contractor had promised they'd be, and spent the following years in a series of situations that each made the next one harder to escape. He had a daughter in the Bronx who he saw on her birthday and on Christmas, and on days when things were going well enough that he felt he could show up without making her worry. Eddie was funny. That was the first thing Arthur noticed. Not performing funny. Not the kind of humor that's really a request for acknowledgement. Just genuinely, casually funny. The way some people are because they have been paying close attention to the absurdity of things for a long time and have decided to find it entertaining rather than crushing. He called the morning security guard Captain America on account of his posture. He had opinions about which of the nearby restaurants left out their day-old bread and which ones threw it away. And he spoke about this with the authority of a food critic. Arthur looked forward to the afternoons when Eddie came around. He had been on the bench for 6 days when Camille appeared. She came out of the building at 11:15 on a Wednesday, moving at the particular pace of someone who is very busy in a way they want to be noticed. She had a meeting at noon across town. She was wearing a coat that Arthur recognized because he had seen on her Instagram page described as sustainably sourced, and she looked, as she always looked, as though she had been assembled rather than dressed. She was almost to the car when she stopped. Arthur felt something lift in his chest. She had seen him. She was stopping. She was walking back toward the bench. Then her assistant appeared from behind her, already raising a phone to shoot. Arthur understood immediately. He watched his daughter crouch down to his level with a warmth that was real in its physical execution and hollow in its intention, the way a performance can be technically perfect and emotionally false at the same time. She pressed $200 into his hands and held them with both of hers. She spoke warmly, clearly, at a volume calibrated for the microphone rather than for him. She asked if he was eating. She said that our veterans deserve so much better than this. When the camera stopped, she stood, smoothed her coat, and walked to the car. She did not look back. Arthur sat with the $200 in his styrofoam cup for an hour. Then he took it out, folded it, and put it in Eddie's hand when Eddie came around that afternoon. He didn't make anything of it. He just did it. Eddie said nothing either. He put the money in his jacket pocket, and they sat for a while watching a pigeon that had found something interesting near the fountain. That evening, Camille's post went up. 700,000 impressions by midnight. The caption read, "Every person has a story. Today I was reminded of mine." She had tagged 3 veteran organizations and a luxury watch brand. Arthur did not sleep that night. He lay in the penthouse, in the same bed where Margaret had slept, where he still slept on his side only and left the other side undisturbed. And he thought about the difference between his daughter and the nurse in the hospital corridor. The nurse had no audience, no camera, no caption. She had simply seen a man in pain and moved toward him without thinking about what it would look like. He thought about Grace. He had not spoken to her since a brief call at Thanksgiving. She had sounded tired in the way people sound when they are carrying a lot and are used to it. She had asked how he was, and he had said fine, and she had known he was lying and not pushed it because she had learned a long time ago that her father closed like a door when he felt seen too directly. He wondered if she would stop. He wondered what it would feel like if she didn't. He fell asleep with the blanket folded on the chair across the room, the jacket hanging on the back of the door, and the question still open. On the 12th day, Richard came out of the building at 8:42 and said, "Get him off my plaza," without breaking stride. Arthur counted to 300 around the corner, came back, sat down. He called Marcus that night. He said, "Change the will. I know what I'm doing. Start the paperwork." Marcus said, "Grace hasn't been yet." Arthur said, "I know. Keep the paperwork moving anyway." He came back the 13th day, and the 14th. He was not waiting for Grace to pass the test. He already knew who his children were. He was waiting, because some part of him needed to see it with his own eyes before he could believe it. The way you need to see a thing to let it be real. Grace Sterling was not supposed to be in New York that Thursday. She had driven up from Atlanta to sign some paperwork related to the estate planning that Marcus had been coordinating, documents that required her signature in person. That was all an administrative necessity. She had planned to be in and out in 4 hours. She had 47 papers to grade over the weekend, and a parent meeting on Monday morning, and a check engine light that had been on for 3 weeks that she kept meaning to do something about. She came out of the Sterling Industries lobby at 11:40, turned left toward the parking garage, and stopped. Not dramatically. Not in the way a person stops when something startles them. She just stopped walking. The way you stop when something pulls your attention without announcing itself, a sound below the threshold of recognition, or a movement at the edge of what you're looking at. She stood still for a moment on the plaza, and then she changed direction. The man on the bench was watching the building. He had a blanket across his lap, and his hands wrapped around a styrofoam cup and the focused stillness of someone who had learned to be very comfortable with nothing happening. He did not look up when she approached. She crouched down so she was at his level. She put her bag on the ground first, without thinking about it, because she was already thinking about him. And she said, "Are you warm enough?" Arthur looked at her. He had not been looked at directly in 2 weeks. Not looked at, seen. The way this woman was looking at him right now, with a tension that was not performing itself, was something he had almost forgotten was possible to receive from a stranger. He said, "Getting there." She nodded. She looked at the cup. She said she was going to get a coffee before her drive back, and asked if she could get him one too. He said he'd appreciate that. She went into the cafe in the lobby and came back in 7 minutes with 2 large coffees and a paper bag that she had not mentioned, and she sat down on the far end of the bench and held out the bag, turkey sandwich, and a packet of chips from the display near the register. She had picked them up without thinking about whether it was appropriate or whether it would be received well or whether it would make a good story. She had just seen a man who might be hungry and bought food. They sat together for 20 minutes. She asked where he'd served, and he told her the story Marcus had helped him construct, Korea-era logistics core outside Busan. He had not fired a weapon. He had moved things from one place to another and kept records of what moved and tried to account for everything so that nothing was lost. She listened the way good listeners listen, not waiting to respond, just actually receiving what he said. She asked what he missed most. He said his wife. She nodded and didn't push it. When she left, she said she might come by tomorrow if she could work it out. She had the drive back and papers to grade and the check engine light. She said the way you say something when you mean it, but aren't sure the world will cooperate. He told her not to go out of her way. She came back the next morning. She had driven from Atlanta, 4 hours each way, turned around, slept in the city, and come back to Plaza at 8:30 with 2 coffees and the particular calm of someone who has made a decision and stopped questioning it. They talked for 35 minutes. She told him she taught 10th grade English in Atlanta, mostly kids who had been told in various ways by various systems that they were not worth the effort. She said this without any performance of virtue, the way you describe your work, when it is simply what you do. She mentioned a student named Jerome who was the most naturally talented writer she had ever taught and who had not turned an assignment in 6 weeks because something at home was making it impossible to function, and the school's response had been to flag him for truancy rather than ask what was happening. She was going to figure out what was happening. She said this with the quiet certainty of someone who was not asking for permission. Arthur thought about all the meetings he had sat in over 50 years of business, where people had discussed what to do about problems with exactly none of that certainty and exactly none of that intention. He asked her about her family. She said it was complicated the way families get when someone important isn't there anymore. She said her mother had been the gravity that held everything in orbit, and without her, everyone had drifted a little. She said she talked to her father sometimes, but that he had a hard time saying the things that needed saying, and she had a hard time pretending that wasn't true. So they mostly spoke in safe territory. Weather, business, how things were going in a general sense. Arthur looked at his coffee cup. She said, "I think he means well. I think he loves us. I just think he got so used to solving problems from a distance that he forgot some problems need you in the room." She came back the third morning with breakfast in a brown paper bag, egg sandwiches, 2 bottles of orange juice, and they sat for 40 minutes while she told him about Jerome and the conversation she had finally had with his mother, who was working 2 jobs and had not known that Jerome had stopped turning things in because Jerome had not told her, because Jerome was 12 years old and tried to protect everyone around him from the weight of his own situation. Grace had stayed after school and sat with him for an hour, and he had written 3 pages. She pulled out her phone and read him 2 paragraphs. They were extraordinary. Not good for a 12-year-old, just good by any standard. Arthur listened to paragraphs and felt something happen in his chest that was not grief and was not joy, but was close to both of them at once. She came back the 4th morning. She was already late for the drive home. She had a parent meeting Monday and the papers and the check engine light. And she sat down anyway, and they talked about nothing in particular for a while, the easy way you talk when the conversation has found its rhythm and doesn't need a destination. Before she stood to leave, she reached into her bag and pulled out a pen and a paper napkin from the coffee place and wrote her number on it. She folded it and pressed it into his jacket pocket, the outer one near the collar. She said, "If you ever need anything." "I mean it." She crossed the plaza. He watched her go until she was too small to see. Arthur Sterling sat on that bench for a long time after she disappeared. The city moved around him the way it always did, indifferent and loud and continuous. He did not wipe his eyes because he did not need to. He just sat with it. What it felt like to be seen by someone who had nothing to gain from seeing you. Someone who had driven 8 hours round trip to bring a stranger breakfast and read him the writing of a 12-year-old boy who was going to be okay because she had decided he was going to be okay. He reached into the outer pocket of his jacket and felt the folded napkin. Then he called Marcus and said, "I need the letter. I'm going to write it tonight." Marcus said, "I'll have the documents ready by Friday." Arthur said, "Tell the attorney to be ready for the reading in 3 weeks." He folded the blanket, tucked it under his arm, picked up the styrofoam cup, and walked around the corner of Sterling Tower for the last time. He took the service elevator to the penthouse. He showered and changed and sat down at the desk in the study, where he had made every significant decision of the last 30 years. He wrote for 2 hours. Not the legal documents. Marcus had those under control. The letter, The one that would be folded around the key and placed in the hidden inner pocket of his father's jacket before the whole thing was sealed and handed to the attorney. The pocket that was stitched inside the lining, invisible unless you already knew it was there, the kind of thing you only found if you were paying close attention to the jacket rather than trying to get rid of it. He wrote about his father. He wrote about Margaret. He wrote about the 4 mornings. He wrote about a 12-year-old boy named Jerome, who he had never met, and who had written 3 pages that changed the way he understood what his youngest daughter had built in Atlanta. He wrote about the nurse in the hospital corridor. He wrote about what it meant to him that she had stopped. Then he wrote the last 5 words and put down the pen. Arthur Sterling died on a Tuesday, or rather, the version of the story that Richard and Camille and the board and the press received stated that Arthur Sterling had passed quietly in a private medical facility, with only his executive assistant present, following a brief illness. The death notice was Marcus's work, precise and minimal, the way Arthur would wanted it. It said nothing about the nature of the illness or the duration of it. It said nothing about the bench. Richard issued a press release within 90 minutes. Camille posted on Instagram within 2 hours a photograph of herself and Arthur from 3 years ago at a charity gala, black and white filter. Caption that began with, "He taught me everything I know about legacy." She had 42,000 responses by midnight. Grace closed her classroom at noon, told her students she had a family matter, and drove north. She did not call Richard. She did not call Camille. She did not post anything. She put the address of Sterling Industries into her phone and drove the 4 hours with the radio off and both hands on the wheel, the way she did everything, without performance, without an audience, with her full attention on the thing in front of her. She arrived in New York at 4:30 in the afternoon. She checked into the same modest hotel near the tower that she always used because she had stayed there with Margaret once, and it felt right to keep going back. She ordered food from the diner across the street and ate at the desk in her room and graded 7 papers before she fell asleep with the pen still in her hand. The will reading was scheduled for 10 a.m. on Thursday. The conference room on the 42nd floor had been prepared by Marcus with the specificity of a man who understood that the details of a room communicate things that the people in the room are not always saying out loud. The long mahogany table, 3 chairs on one side, one empty at the far end, the attorney's position at the head. A single item on a cloth in the center of the table, covered. Richard arrived first, 7 minutes early, in the charcoal suit he wore when he wanted to communicate authority without appearing to try. He was accompanied by his personal attorney, who the family attorney noted was present but said nothing about because he had been told to expect it. Richard looked at the covered item on the table and looked away. He shook the family attorney's hand and poured himself water and stood near the window with the posture of a man receiving something that is already his. Camille arrived 3 minutes later in a coat Arthur had not seen before. She was accompanied by an assistant who was told to wait outside. She kissed Richard once on each cheek the European way and said something quiet about it all being such a shock and looked at the covered item on the table with an expression that was calibrated between grief and efficiency. Grace arrived exactly at 10. She was wearing what she had been wearing the day before. Dark slacks, a plain jacket, a shirt that was clean and pressed because she ironed her own clothes on Sunday evenings before the week began. She did not hug Richard or Camille. She nodded to them and sat at the far end of the table and put her hands in her lap and waited. The family attorney began with the standard provisions, the trusts, the charitable foundations, the operating protocols for Sterling Industries in the transitional period. The language was precise and bureaucratic and went on for some time. Richard relaxed visibly at approximately the 12-minute mark. He had read enough wills to know that the standard provisions being intact meant the larger structure was intact, and the larger structure being intact meant the succession he had been positioning for since his mother's funeral was almost certainly proceeding as he had expected. He allowed himself a small private sense of relief. Things were going to be fine. Then the attorney placed his hand on the cloth in the center of the table and said, "There is a final codicil." The relief left Richard's face the way water leaves a glass that has been knocked over, all at once, suddenly, with no way to reverse it. The attorney said the codicil had been added 11 weeks ago and had been filed and registered and witnessed according to the full requirements of New York estate law, and its provisions were legally binding in their entirety. He said this without looking up from the document. Then he looked up. He said, "The codicil supersedes all personal inheritance provisions for the 3 primary heirs. Each heir will receive 1 item from the personal effects of Arthur Harlan Sterling." He removed the cloth. The military jacket lay on the mahogany table, old, worn at the collar, folded with a precision that had outlasted the man who had taught it. Richard looked at it. Then he laughed. It was not a warm laugh. It was a laugh of a man who has decided something is a joke before he has fully processed whether it is. He said, "This is not real." He said it to his own attorney, who said nothing. He said, "This is going to court by Monday." Camille said nothing. She was looking at the jacket with an expression Arthur would have recognized, the expression she wore when she was deciding how to position something. Grace stood up and walked to the table and picked up the jacket. She lifted it the way you lift something that belonged to someone you loved, carefully, with both hands, not because it was fragile, but because it deserved that. She held it against her for a moment, and then she sat back down at her end of the table with the jacket across her lap, and her hands on it and her eyes down. Richard said, "What are you doing?" He said it sharp, the way he said everything when things weren't going his way. He pushed back his chair and reached across toward the jacket. He was going to put it in the bin. He had already decided. Grace moved it back and said, "Don't." One word. She didn't raise her voice. She just said the word with a finality that made Richard stop. She sat with the jacket in her lap and ran her hands over fabric. She didn't know what she was doing. Not exactly. She was not looking for anything. She was just sitting with it because it felt wrong to put it down. Her hands moved along the lining, along the inner edge of the left panel, and her fingers found something, a seam that was stitched closed, deliberately, carefully, with a different thread than the rest of the jacket. The kind of stitching you do when you are hiding something inside something and you want it to hold. She pulled at the edge of the seam, and the pocket opened. Inside, a small key on a plain ring, and a letter, folded twice, in handwriting she recognized because she had grown up reading birthday cards in that handwriting and report card notes, and once, on a Tuesday in November 4 years ago, a text message that said, "I am proud of you," followed immediately by a second text that said, "That is a whole message," and then a third that said, "Your father is trying to learn emoji and it is not going well." She unfolded the letter. She read it. The room was completely silent. Richard had stopped moving. Camille had put her phone face down on the table. The attorney looked at the window. She read it twice. Then she set it down very carefully on the table in front of her, face down, like something private. She put both hands flat on the table and sat still. The conference room door opened. Arthur Sterling walked in. He was clean-shaven, navy suit, the silver hair combed back the way it always was. He walked ahead of the table and stood there and looked at his children, at Richard, who had gone to color chalk, at Camille, whose expression had moved past calculation into something that might have been genuine, and at Grace, who was looking at it with an openness that had none of the distance in it she'd learned to keep between them. She said, "You were there. You were the man on the bench." He said, "Yes." She said, "I didn't know it was you." He said, "I know." She said, "How long?" He said, 17 days. "For mornings with you." She looked at the letter face down on the table. She turned it over and looked at the last line. Then she looked at him. He said, "The key in your hand opens a vault on the 4th subfloor. The founding patents, the original shares, the letter of succession, all of it has been in your name since 3 weeks ago, Thursday. You don't have to run the company. You don't have to do anything with it you don't want to do, but it's yours because you stopped." Richard stood up. He said a great number of things in sequence with escalating volume. Arthur listened to all of it. He did not respond to any of it because there was nothing to respond to. The documents were registered. The attorney had copies. Marcus had copies. The thing was done. Grace did not look at Richard while he was speaking. She was looking at the jacket in her lap. She was looking at the pocket she had found and the thread that had held it closed for however long it had been closed, waiting. She was thinking about a bench outside a building and a man who had held a styrofoam cup in both hands and watched the revolving doors the way a man watches something that used to belong to him. She thought about the 4 mornings. She thought about Jerome. She thought about the sandwiches and the orange juice and the fact that she had driven 8 hours round trip twice without thinking twice about it, because that was what you did when a person needed company. She thought about the last line of the letter, 5 words in her father's handwriting on the second fold of the page. "You were kind." That's everything. Arthur lived for 4 more years. He and Grace rebuilt what the company had been built to be in the first place. Not smaller, not louder, just truer to the thing his father had taught him without words, through 31 years on a factory floor and the careful folding of a jacket. Richard made his peace with it eventually, in the partial way that people who have never been wrong make peace with things. Camille took longer, but she came around in the way people come around when the alternative is being alone at Christmas. Grace kept teaching. She ran the company in the mornings and stood in front of classroom in the afternoons because she had decided years ago that what a person does with their time is the most honest thing about them, and she intended to be honest. On the wall of her classroom, framed in plain wood, Between a student's drawing of a bird and a periodic table someone had to face in a way she had decided was too clever to take down, is a paper napkin with 5 words on it in her father's handwriting. She has never told her students what it is. A few of them have asked. She tells them it's a reminder. They leave it at that. If you found out your father had been watching you from the pavement for a year, would you feel relieved or terrified? Drop 1 word in the comments. I read every single one. And I'll see you in the next story.